everyone, and welcome to another Risky Business product demo. My name is Patrick Gray, and today we are going to be having a chat with the founders of Authentik, and that's Authentik with a K, and Authentik is an open source identity provider. So you can think of it like an alternative to Microsoft Entra, to Okta, those sorts of things. It's an authentication platform that you can run yourself. And as I already mentioned, it is open source. So the founders are joining me now. Fletcher Heisler is the chief executive. G'day, Fletcher.
G'day.
And we've also got Jens Langhammer, who is the CTO of Authentik. Jens, thank you for joining us.
Hello.
So I've got to disclose right off the bat that Authentik is a sponsor. This is a sponsored demo. And further to that, I'm actually an advisor to the company. But let's kick it off. Fletcher, you wanted to give us an overview, which is going to save me from doing it. And then we'll move on to the hard demo part of all of this. So go. Give us your overview of Authentik.
Sounds good. Yeah, I'll go over just the very high level, and then Jens can get into the actual details of the product demo, go through some features. I'll start out here just on our homepage, goauthentik.io. Again, as Pat mentioned, this is all self-hosted, open source, and so you can go to our GitHub. It is under the hood, essentially a Django project. You can see we're very actively developing. Looks like someone's pushing code right now, actually. But a very wide, vibrant community there, although obviously we maintain a close eye on what gets merged in. It's not just a community effort as well. So in terms of getting started, if you go out to our documentation, within installation, we have all the guides for, inevitably there's some lingo that goes along with being a full identity provider. But to get started, you can self-host essentially on your local machine just using Docker Compose. Takes a couple minutes to get spun up. We have a Helm chart as well, so most of our customers use Kubernetes in production. We also have CloudFormation templates, so we're on the AWS Marketplace. You can spin things up that way. Essentially, Authentik is a stateless server that can scale up and down as needed. Alongside Postgres, so not a lot of bells and whistles to configure and maintain there. Could also be run even in air-gapped environments. So we have some highly confidential environments that you can use a licensed version of Authentik within as well. As you mentioned, this is primarily free and open source. All of it is source available. If anyone is interested in specifically some of these enterprise features, we can always set up a trial account as well. Just reach out and you could poke around some of that as well. So I won't go through all of these, but just to mention in terms of sort of key differentiators and what we focus on. Authentik is made to be very flexible. So everything that you'll see Jens going through and doing in the UI are API endpoints that are also available to you. Everything is very much made as infrastructure as code. So we have a Terraform provider you could use as well. This is also mostly focused on the traditional workforce IAM, but SIAM as well. And we have a number of customers who are using both their employees and their end customers or contractors or partners within a single platform, managing that within a single instance. So we'll get into sort of the flexibility. We mentioned a lot of these pieces. I would say another thing in terms of self-hosting, we have a FIPS compliant build. And so, name your compliance acronym of choice. Generally speaking, we can help with making that much easier than having to check the box with another separate vendor as well. In terms of the flexibility, I won't go through every single thing. A lot of the features you'd expect from any full-fledged IDP, like impossible travel detection. I think the difference there is, with something like Okta, they will flag that for you and sort of make those decisions for you, and you can use that as a pre-built boxed feature. We have those templates as well, but you can use signals like that however you'd like in a very customizable way. So you might combine that with other detection mechanisms, maybe with your particular MDM solution or something like that. So you can make much more full use of the tools that you have at your disposal already within your IDP and send all those signals back. Name a protocol, we speak it. and a long list of integrations here. So some of these are enterprise specific. Many of them are sort of community added as well. But the way that we are built, it's quite simple relative to a black box closed source code provider, where you might just have to wait and say, well, Apple's added a new attribute. When do I get to use that? With Authentik, that's typically 1 to 4 lines of code, or something that we can write in very easily for customers as well. And you'll see, quite a few familiar folks in terms of getting the most from your providers, and a lot of potentially overlapping functionality. But we want to be vendor agnostic as well, and integrate with as much in the ecosystem as we can.
If people were wondering why I went there, it's because Knock Knock is a company I work pretty closely with, so that's why I was happy to see that. And I see you've got like Apache Guacamole there, which is like, that's a way to get that's an RDP via web thing, isn't it? So you can then start provisioning remote RDP through the IDP in a secure way, and there's just a lot you can do there.
It is. We actually have our own remote access gateway as well, so you can RDP and SSH, browser based through Authentik as well. So if I go out to our instance, I think we have a Windows demo here as well. I won't take the time to go into that, but another option as well. So I'll hand it over to Jens to go through the actual platform and a little bit more of what does it look like as an end user or an end administrator setting some of these pieces up.
All right, so this is a demo of Authentik, starting with the things that you might want to do when you first install it, kind of going through all the steps, all the usual steps that you would usually go through, and then kind of expanding to round out everything that it supports. So I'm just going to log into this instance. This is our internal instance. As you can see, a standard login screen as you would expect anywhere. But keep in mind, all of this is fully customizable. So you can have username on one page, then password. If you have external users that might have SSO externally, you might want to have that on 2 separate stages. Afterwards, MFA, for example, which is what we have here, where I can sign in with my passkey. But you can also use things like Duo. You can use things like TOTP. You can have email verification. You can have basically full customization, and I'll get to more of that later. Once you're logged in, you get the same screen that Fletcher already showed. You can see all the applications that your user has access to, the standard kind of dashboard, including with all the user settings where you can adjust your profile. You can manage your sessions and stuff like that, manage your MFA devices, all the things that you would want your end users to be able to do. And again, all of this is customizable. So you could send, for example, I don't want end users to modify their profile because XYZ reason. You can just disallow that, for example. Then the actual heart of it, and this is probably where I'll spend most of the demo, is the admin interface for the configuration. So going through kind of the initial setup, saying you have a new instance, you just download Authentik to play around with. The first step is usually adding an application, and so this is where you can say like, okay, I want to have something authenticated with Authentik, and one example that we use pretty commonly would be like something like Grafana. So you have your applications, your provider, which I'll explain in a second, where you would go in and configure Grafana. We in Authentik have a separation between application provider, which a lot of other platforms have as one object, where in Authentik there's kind of a separation between the application being what the user actually sees, as in like the name and the logo and things like that, as well as the access control is in the application. And then things like, your protocol, like your OAuth and your SAML and all of that stuff is in the provider. So that's separated, and that also allows you to switch things more seamlessly by keeping the same application and the same access control. So I'll go to this application, for example, and again, you can see here, how you configure access. You can say, okay, I want to give this group access, that group access. This ties into our policy system, which is going to be a topic that's going to come up quite a few in different sections of Authentik. And you can do all the standard things. You can give access to groups. You can give access to users specifically. But with the policy system, you can also make things a lot more dynamic. So for example, as out of picking out a list here, you can say, okay, I want a policy that only allows things from certain IP ranges, some from certain geo-IP areas.
We don't need people logging in from Timbuktu, right? Like,
for example,
it's just not going to happen. Yeah.
For example, yeah. You can have a reputation policy as well, which is more so like a kind of like a fail to ban type setup where you can have X failed logins or X failed authentication attempts before, again, doing whatever you want. You can say, okay, after 3 failed attempts, the user might have to do an extra CAPTCHA or might have to do an email verification or something like that. And then you also have the most powerful option being the expression policy, where you can go in and write some Python to do any kind of custom logic. So, for example, reach out to an internal server to check against some data there, check some custom user attributes.
What are people using that to do mostly? Because usually when you've got that sort of flexible feature where you can drop in some Python or stuff, there's going to be like 3 use cases that everybody does. And they're not going to use it. They're not going to use 99% of the world of possibilities there, but everybody's going to use 3. Like, what are those 3?
I feel like a pretty good picture, it paints a pretty good picture of what people use the most by the kind of helper functions that exist, which is a lot of stuff like, checking for group membership, getting a specific user and things like that. Checking, for example, this is pretty common, checking if a user has a specific type of multi-factor authentication device. This one is also relatively new, but also very useful for advanced use cases, is you can, within the policy, create a JWT token to then use that to authenticate an HTTP request to a different service to get data. So the example with getting data from a different service is actually pretty common. Usually, especially during migrations where you have I have this old legacy system where a bunch of user info is stored, and I want to use that to make access decisions.
Then you can do that with this, yeah. I was actually going to ask, speaking of migrations, I mean, you're sort of showing us, hey, you've set up Authentik and here you go, and this is how you run it. But I'm guessing for most people who are they're switching, right? They're actually switching away from another IDP. What's the process for doing the switch? I mean, I'm not trying to mess up the flow of your demo too bad. Maybe you want to get to that later, or is that something you can tell us now, or how do you want to do that?
I'll get to that. I'll finish the applications and I'll get to that, because I was going to say that is probably going to be your next interest after setting up, okay, I have my application, now let me get all my users in. You might want to do that first, but I think for most cases, okay, I have this installed. I want to see that it actually, is all set up.
Oh, okay, right. So that would be the process: is actually just add an application, make sure it's all working, and then worry about sucking in that directory. Yeah,
that's how I would do it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm not an admin, man. You're the expert. That's why I'm asking.
All good.
I'd say one other common use case for expression policies that's not quite covered there, but will tie into the migration and having 5 different systems you need to correlate back to each other. Is having slightly more complex logic than makes sense to set up in a big flowchart. So you might say, if someone's part of this group and that group, we need these requirements. But if they're part of that group, that sort of thing that you can do with a couple lines of Python, and is a lot easier.
Just build a little decision tree that you can just stuff in there.
Exactly, because in the UI you can select as group of this or as group of that, but realistically, most companies are going to have a more complex group structure. So I might want to say this, or that, but not this, and that kind of.
Except on Fridays. Yeah.
Exactly. So you could say as member of who, or as member of bar, and then say and not member of Baz. And then you can say, okay, that's the policy decision that I want to make. That's how this user has access to this application, kind of thing.
Yeah.
With the applications, I'm going to quickly go through the providers in this part. So again, as I said, this is where you configure the actual protocol. So in this case, we have a proxy provider. I'll get through the list in a second to there's all the protocols that Fletcher already mentioned. And this is where you then configure all the protocols. I'm not going to go too deep into the settings because this is, to show an instance that has real world data, I'm using our instance, but of course I don't want to show any sensitive data. So, this is one of the applications that we use, for example. And this is where you configure all the protocol details. As we already list on the website, we have all the LDAPs and OAuth and SAML that you might expect. Skim for user provisioning, shared signals framework, which is a relatively new addition. And then for legacy things, LDAP already mentioned, and Radius for applications. I mean, basically every company has some legacy applications that either don't support modern SSO or don't support SSO at all. So you can use LDAP and Radius for that, as well as the proxy provider, which I think the kind of more well-known name for it would be like I think GCP has it as the identity aware proxy. I think that's kind of the more commonly, the more commonly known term for it. And then we also have a Google Workspace and Microsoft Entra integration, which allows you to provision users from Authentik into those clouds.
And a pretty common use case there that we see a lot is folks who, by way of acquisition or just sort of natural growth, end up with half Google Workspace, half Microsoft, and sort of paying double licenses for everybody and having trouble federating both into each other. So being able to be that go-between and say, here you have a source of truth, and use whichever provider you need wherever. Yeah,
it's a story as old as time, that one.
Yeah. Now, I've just switched to a different instance. This is a demo instance that we have that is has a lot less, basically no sensitive data. So this is a lot easier in here to click around on random things. But to get to the next step that you are very likely to want to do after setting up your first application is getting all your users into it. And there's all the options. The most common one that you're most likely going to use is probably something like an Active Directory, or like a Google Cloud or like an Entra. So in Authentik, that's called a source of users that they can either use for just-in-time kind of single sign-on, where when the user is attempting to log into Authentik, they will get redirected through the source and then authenticated and provisioned, or the more directory style, kind of like an LDAP, like a SCIM source, things like that. Alongside in this list, you'll also see all the social sources. So if you're using Authentik in a more customer-facing environment, you might want to have your login with Facebook, your login with Google, and things like that. And with that, you have different options of how you want the users provisioned. In this case, we actually have a Authentik as a source, which is our main Authentik instance is a source to this instance, so that we can single sign on into the demo instance. And
yeah, so you've got your own directory as well, right? Like it's not just using others as a source. Yeah,
that is a very good point to mention as well. There's a built-in directory, so all of the users that are either pulled in from a directory or created dynamically are stored within Authentik, and that basically allows you to directly assign permissions to them, manage group memberships and stuff like that. It can be your primary source if you want to. If you want to keep your Active Directory as a primary source, that also works. You can again mess with all the other options. It's up to you how you want to have things running.
Are most people using like Authentik as the directory, or are they sticking with their AD or whatever?
We're touching on migrations again then a bit, in that you can stand up Authentik alongside your 1 to 5 other IDPs and solutions, and as you've migrated everything over, as you now have a trustable source of truth there, you can switch that off and start turning off the other spigots. So got it. You can kind of seamlessly decide when.
We've seen a good distribution of people either using Authentik as their primary directory, and some people for either other legacy reasons or for other integration reasons sticking with some sort of LDAP-based directory. But yeah, as Fletcher mentioned already, is once you have the source in here, you can then basically start the migration already almost. Because once you have the source in here, once you have your application in here, it's basically seamless for the user to then access that application. They might get a flash of an Authentik screen, but then they will be redirected through your old IDP, and then they'll end up at the application. So it's very seamless from that perspective. And you can also go steps further to make that more dynamic, and we'll get to that later. But from a very kind of initial migration point, that's basically the requirement to have that. The other points I was going to go over are more so about like customization. So this is kind of more so, okay, I have my applications. I'm starting to kind of have some applications, some users, or might actually be more so in the beginning of like, okay, I have these very specific requirements that our compliance team wants, or security team wants, or someone in the organization wants. And so I'll show some examples for some very common ones. So for example, you might have a very hard, I would actually say it's a very common, thing to just have hard requirement on MFA. And all of these steps that are part of the authentication and or authorization in Authentik are managed through flows, which is basically a description of what the user needs to do to be authenticated or be authorized to an application. And so each individual step is called a stage, where each stage can be something like a password check or MFA validation or custom things that you might want to add. And this that I've opened here is the default authentication flow. So this is what we ship out of the box pretty much. And you can see here in the diagram, the user needs to identify first. So this is just your standard kind of username input. Then the next stage is password validation, and then they get logged in. And you can see in here it's an ordered list of things that happen, and each of these stages have their different options that you can configure. And there's a lot of these that I'll get to, but there's an even bigger list of possible stages that you can have in here, which is again, MFA validation. You can have captchas, different setup stages for different kinds of MFA devices, for example, Duo, email-based, WebAuthn. We have endpoint integration with Google Device Trust, so you can use that to make sure that things can only be accessed from a corporate managed device, for example. Recently,
what about integrations to do fancy stuff with things like CrowdStrike and like some of the EDR providers?
Yeah, we're currently primarily doing Google Device Trust as kind of a preview feature, for both the sake of how are people using this and how do we want to integrate it deeper into Authentik. So Google Device Trust is the first one that we've added for that one. But
you got plans to go more, to build more sort of device health attestation features that integrate and whatnot?
Yeah, we've got plans to add support for other common providers, as you mentioned, something like CrowdStrike, to add, well, also even things like Duo, since that already does a lot of that as well. Yeah. And also to have our own option for having a fully authentic way of doing that, and getting device compliance data from that.
Yep.
Yeah, we do have some other device management pieces as well that you can integrate with directly. And again, it's flexible enough. You can build that in generally, at least at a surface level, pretty quickly, even if that's not something that we already have as a drop-down selection.
Yep.
Yep. Another relatively new one is the MTLS stage. So for client certificate authentication is an option that you can also do as an extra factor, as a primary factor, however you want it to be. You have options for adding even like completely arbitrary prompts. So if you wanted to, what we've seen quite frequently is people using kind of once they're a bit further along in their Authentik setup is they want to use it as part of their onboarding flow to have like, okay, ideally we send a new person joining this link, they click on it, maybe input their password or something like that. Then they set up their MFA devices, they input some data about themselves and all kinds of things like that as part of the onboarding process. And with the prompt stage, you can very easily do that and let the users kind of have just one link and basically onboard themselves from that perspective. And then this is the other one I wanted to mention. I said earlier with the sources that, you create your source for your existing identity provider, and that's basically it from the migration. So that's for the kind of, okay, I have one IDP kind of thing. I have like an Okta or Keycloak instance or something like that, and that's what all my users are. We do also have a source stage, which allows you to basically nest that entire process of authenticating with an external identity provider within an existing flow. So you can then make even more customizable decisions like, okay, based on this attribute or this email address or something like that, they might need to go different places and things like that.
And people would notice too that a few of these features, they have that little enterprise only marker on them, which is like, this is an open source platform, but the way Authentik, the company, makes money is by licensing various features that are only really relevant to enterprise, right? So, if you're an SME that needs an IDP, I mean, it's going to be free. If you're a giant megacorp that needs exotic, very niche enterprise features that only apply to big companies, you might have to license it.
Yep, that is our goal with the enterprise features, to kind of, because obviously the open sourceness is both for transparency and security, but also for home lab users to be able to just use the product, get familiar with it, play around with it, even if they're just enthusiasts. I mean, that's where it started from me personally. So I want that's very much a big focus, to have it available for everyone.
Well, even a small company can a medium company can absolutely use this. It's only when you're getting into those like absolutely enterprise specific use cases that you might want to license some of these modules.
Yeah, it depends on things like support and stuff like that.
Yeah, which is another part of it, obviously.
Yeah. One thing so going through the stages, so these are all the options that you have, all the kind of steps that you can create. However, that's all very static. So that would allow you to kind of create a static list of steps that a user has to go through. However, within here and within Authentik, you can also use policies to make that entire thing very dynamic. So you can add policies to each kind of, before each step happens, you can configure policies to be run to say, again, as I mentioned with the kind of reputation, with the fail to ban like setup, you would have a policy that would check before the user identifies themselves, okay, what is their score? Or even later on, you could say, okay, if this user is in a specific group, they might have a hard MFA requirement. So for example, one concrete example that we've had of that was a customer that requires general MFA. They always want MFA, but for certain users or when accessing certain applications, it needs to be a different kind of MFA. It needs to be like a FIPS compliant MFA. And so for that, you would basically just have the multi-factor validation configured to allow any device. And then you could have the second one of those only for that specific group of users. And then basically invert the policy on the other one, which would then make it so by default, everyone gets standard MFA, but if you're in that specific group, if you're accessing that specific application, you need to have MFA with that specific type of device. And there's no restrictions in these policies. So even in here, you could also do the same example as I said earlier of fetching data from an external service. Again, there's full freedom of Python. Whatever you can think of, you can do in here.
Excellent.
I was actually going to to mention this part a bit earlier as part of the applications, but it's also a good part once you have some more applications, and especially some more eccentric applications, maybe even something kind of semi-legacy. You're most likely going to have some applications that have a very specific format with how they want data to be sent to them or how they send data to Authentik. And so in Authentik, that's handled through property mappings, which is basically the transformation of how the data from a source is put into Authentik and how the source from Authentik is given out to an application. So in here you have all the standard ones, and you can see things like Active Directory, all of the kind of default ones that you would expect. And so there's also mappings in here for things like OIDC. But again, for some applications, that might need to be in a different format. So let me open the standard OAuth profile one, for example. So you can see this is also a Python expression. And you have the same freedom as you do in policies, but you basically, you can, if you want to say, okay, this application requires first name, last name, or requires, kind of a different structure of data, or requires even differently encoded data, that's all possible to fully configure in here and fully specify, okay, this is how I want the data to be sent to that application. And actually, we're quickly switching back to the previous instance. There is also a preview that you get shown of saying like, okay, this is the data that gets sent to that application as with all the property mappings. Then after that, at this point, kind of following along with the story, at this point, you have a pretty big Authentik instance. You have all your users migrated. You have all your applications set up. You might now think, okay, how do I turn this into infrastructure as code? Especially, kind of, I suppose in this story, given a company that doesn't necessarily do that from the start. In Authentik, as Fletcher already mentioned, we have a Terraform provider that's fully supported, and we also have a system built in called Blueprints. So this allows you to specify your Authentik configuration in YAML. That's kind of the one sentence summary of this. The other use case where this is really, really helpful is when you, for example, want to give a team the ability to create applications within Authentik. Like, let's say you want to give your developer team, or you have in a really big company, multiple product teams, they should be able to self-provision an application. You can create a blueprint where you say, okay, this is how the application should be configured. You can say these are the permissions that need to be set. These are the people that should have access. And you can give that to people and kind of provide it in a way where people can self-provision from that, but still your defaults are honored. They can only change the settings that you allow them to change.
Well, I guess that point is, control and granularity, right? Which is a theme through the whole demo.
Exactly. So yeah, you can basically just offer that, and with one API call, they can provision an application just how you want it to be. We also have some things planned around this for more kind of community, almost hub, quote unquote, where people can share these blueprints and because they can be used for anything. It doesn't have to be an application and a provider. It can be a flow. You can be even if I go to the website and go to our example flows. We have a lot of examples for kind of things that you might want to set up, like if you have end users, you might want to have enrollment with email verification, very stereotypical setup that you might want to have. And there are these files linked here. These are all YAML files that are blueprints. So, kind of flows like that, you can put that in a YAML file, share with people, even policies, anything like that. All makes it very shareable. One other thing I want to mention as well are brands. So in Authentik, let's say in a company you have several different, either external brands or different organization units and things like that, or maybe even acquisitions. And you want the Authentik, we want Authentik to look correct, basically, for each of those units. You can configure branding, which is also where you configure your default flows. So this is, for example, also saying like, okay, this brand uses this flow by default for authentication, or uses this flow for other things by default. But it allows you to also change things like the icons and the general kind of branding of that specific brand.
Yeah. So if you're a company like, I don't know, LVMH, which operates a whole bunch of luxury brands, right? Like Tiffany's and Moe, whatever. Like they can, skin them up the way they want. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, makes sense.
One more thing. Yeah, we're doing full Apple now. One more thing.
One more thing. You got to go full
alongside
Tim Cook.
The compliance stuff that Fletcher already mentioned. All the events that happen in Authentik are logged within Authentik. So you both get these here in the web interface where you can look through them and inspect the events. But they're also logged as a container in a very kind of standard way to standard out, so you can very easily pipe them into your logging aggregation tool of choice and do further analysis there. And that's also one of the things that you have with the enterprise version, is you have full, even enhanced audit logging here, where you see even more data. The other thing that is very powerful with these events is that you can also, again, coming back to policies, you can trigger policies with these events. So, for example, one thing that we ship by default is a rule that matches any kind of configuration error. So the events have an action, just a type kind of classification. And you can say, or by default, we say, okay, any event with the configuration error type will trigger an alert that gets sent to admins by email. And the way this works is we, again, with policies, matching by type configuration error, and that then goes to the email transport. And so with transports as well, you can have webhooks, you can have Slack integration. You can even...
Yeah, I was actually going to ask too, and I'm guessing, can you spit that out into its own separate log?
Yeah, you can also do that.
Yeah.
You can also have them just show up.
Because, you want your full logs, but then you maybe want your real nasty logs as well, like in its own little bucket, right?
Your
alarming logs.
Exactly. Yeah. I should also add that all of the logs that come out of Authentik are JSON, so very easy to parse and stuff like that. And so one use case that we actually use with this is we use a policy in here that gets triggered whenever a token is updated. So in Authentik itself, an API token, things like that. And we have a policy that writes that token into HashiCorp Vault. So it does kind of break the quote unquote rule of like a policy always has to say like yes or no, because in this case, it's very much just to do some logic to write a thing somewhere. But this is a very legitimate use case of saying, okay, we manage our secrets with HashiCorp Vault. We want them from Authentik to be in HashiCorp Vault. So this policy gets triggered every time the token is updated or created. And we don't even need to worry about it. It's just sent directly from here. I think that's about all that I have to show.
Right, well, that's it, I guess, for the demo. Jens Langhammer, thank you so much. Fletcher Heisler, great to see you as always. If people want to go and find Authentik, Authentik with a K, pretty easy to find, really. But goauthentik.io is the website. And it's great to see, I guess, seeing it, you can see how much work has gone into the platform and how many hours have gone into building this whole thing out. So Jens, Fletcher, thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.